You have to push Americans very far for them to be violent. And this is because we have a tradition of justice and even-handedness in this country. Now the left is throwing that to the wind. We hope that we can redress this peacefully and should not take any bait to react violently, because that will only make things worse.
Hi everyone, this is Veronica Kirilenko of the New American Magazine. The leftist ideologies and policies have become as un-American as radical. Strict gun control and extreme abortion legislation, insane education policies that corrupt and sexualize children, COVID lockdowns and mandates are just a few examples. Why is it happening? Today, I'm joined by Robert Spencer, the director of Jihad Watch, a prolific writer and author of the Sumter Gambit, How the Left is Trying to Foment a Civil War. Robert, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Good to speak with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Before we get to discussing your book, I'd like to get your comments on the World Economic Forum meeting this week in Davos with many congressmen and American officials attending the event. In the context of the left fomenting a civil war, do you see the WEF as a part of this effort?
Very much so. It's a central, pivotal part of this effort, in fact. The WEF is a kind of super government that seems to be assuming that it has power over the national governments of the various nations. And so far, there has not been any pushback from any of the nations of the West. All of, or almost all of, the leaders of these various countries are tied in with the WEF, are listed on its website as being involved with it in various ways. And so it seems as if the WEF justifiably has aroused suspicion that it is the one that is really in charge, that it is telling the leaders of the Western nations what they need to do in order to work toward the ultimate goal of a socialist, internationalist megastate. And consequently, when we speak about the civil war that's looming in the United States, the WEF can't be left out of it, because the first thing that the WEF wants to do is destroy the national sovereignty of the United States as the world's foremost nation state at this time, in order to be able to form its internationalist superstate.
Yes, absolutely. Sir, while talk of a possible civil war resurfaces in political discourse from time to time, it's really frightening to consider actual fighting in America. So please explain the title of your book and your motivation for writing it.
Certainly. The Sumter Gambit refers to Fort Sumter, where the Civil War in the United States started in 1861. And the left is now trying to provoke a new Fort Sumter moment that would start another civil war. The clearest indication of this was Joe Biden's speech on September 1st, 2022, the anniversary of Hitler's invasion of Poland. And in that speech, for the very first time in the history of the United States, an American president declared that his principal opponent and his entire following, which amounts to essentially half of the electorate, was out of the bounds of what was acceptable in American public discourse today. Never before has this happened. As virulent as the disagreements have been in American politics, no president before has said, this point of view is a threat to the republic. But that's what Joe Biden said about Donald Trump and the so-called MAGA Republicans on September 1st, 2022. Now, when a president says that his entire opposition, half of the country, is a threat to the republic, that's extraordinarily ominous and is a prelude to the Civil War, because obviously the next step is this great threat to the republic must be neutralized. And so it has to be silenced and then criminalized. And that will lead to a conflict that could become a civil war.
And do you see it happening? The criminalization and demonization and neutralization of the MAGA Republicans?
Very much so, yes. The Twitter files have revealed over the last few weeks that the Biden administration worked with the social media giants in order to silence people who spoke about its COVID agenda in a negative way and about other aspects of its agenda in a negative manner. And this is a direct assault upon the freedom of speech, which is guaranteed in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So once again, for the first time, or for one of the first times, we have an American administration that is actually not adhering to American values at all, but is an authoritarian regime, or wants to be an authoritarian regime. Not only did it work with the social media giants, but the Biden administration attempted to establish a disinformation governance board, which is the kind of thing we've seen in the past in totalitarian regimes, an arm of the U.S. government that would determine what was disinformation and presumably silence it accordingly. Now, the problem with that is that disinformation is in the eye of the beholder, and a great deal of what the establishment in the United States has said is disinformation has turned out to be absolutely true. Example, Hunter Biden's laptop and the evidence of his influence peddling and so on. This was called disinformation by 50 top intelligence officials in the United States. And then it turned out that they were the ones spreading the disinformation. So if the disinformation governance board had been in place at that time, then the people speaking about Hunter's laptop would have been silenced, not the intelligence officials, because the intelligence officials are part of the same establishment that set up the disinformation board.
So how exactly do you define the left? Is it just the establishment? Because it seems like the instigation of the war is obviously a multi-pronged effort, so there must be multiple groups engaged in it. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a multi-pronged effort that involves the left in the corporations and the left in the government and the left in the media. And so in this sense, it's a quintessentially fascist effort, because the fascists, as opposed to the communists, would not nationalize all the industries, but would coordinate them. Hitler called in the captains of industry in Germany and made it very clear to them that he was going to make sure that they did what he said. And if they didn't, there would be consequences. But he didn't nationalize the industries. He left them in private hands. Nowadays, we have the social media giants, the big corporations, the media willingly working with the Democrat Party. And this is the same kind of effort, that they are all coordinating together in order to achieve the same ends. This is how fascism works.
So who do you see as battling sides in the hypothetical civil war if, God forbid, it does start?
This would be a very ugly situation in the United States, because in the first Civil War, there was a clear geographic differentiation between the two camps. But nowadays, there is not. There are patriots and America First people all over the country, and there are socialist internationalists all over the country. And so the idea of a civil war would be extraordinarily bloody, and on the basis of practically street level differentiations between house and house and neighborhood, and the kind of hand-to-hand combat comparable to what we've seen in places like Liberia. That's the kind of thing that is looming in the United States, not a matter of state versus state.
Well, I can imagine patriotic Americans defending themselves and their families and their values, but I cannot really imagine the leftists who do not usually own guns and who do not know how to use them actually being on assault or trying to kill somebody. Or do you?
That's correct. That's right. But the left has the government with it and the military. And so while there are probably many people in the military who would not go along if it came to a war against their own people, there are others who would. Just as we've seen with the police. I used to assume that the police were people who were of the point of view that law and order was important and that they were patriotic Americans and so on. And that's true to a great degree. But there are also people who are in the police who think, well, I just follow orders. And they're like the Nazis on trial in Nuremberg after the war, saying, I was only following orders. And they'll follow orders no matter what, and no matter who they come from and what they're told to do. And we've seen this with police cracking down on pro-lifers and the SWAT teams sent out to arrest pro-life activists, and people like Roger Stone, a 70-year-old man who's not a threat to anyone. And they can get officials to go ahead and do this. They can get police officers to actually engage in this kind of brutalization instead of saying, no, I won't do it. This is wrong. This is un-American, and so on.
Sir, do you see any indications that patriotic Americans will take the bait and respond to the provocations in the way the left wants them to? As far as I can tell, there was no aggressive pushback against the COVID lockdowns back in 2020. Well, yes, there were businesses that did not comply and stayed open, but nobody stormed the governor's mansions, for example. And then, unfortunately, for example, drag shows are taking place across the country as we speak, but there are no homophobic attacks. The only visible instance of something resembling a pushback occurred in response to the stolen election of 2020 on January 6th. But then these events were evidently influenced, if not orchestrated, by the government, which I guess illustrates your point. So what's the probability, in your opinion, that conservatives will fall into the hands of dictator wannabes in the future, maybe in the near future? And I'm not talking about, the bullhorn shirtless guys taking selfies at the Capitol, but the ordinary, everyday moms and dads.
I think that it's very unlikely, and that the situation would have to get much worse than it is now for actual conservatives to take the bait and take up arms, which is just what the left wants, because then they can justify their authoritarian measures in a crackdown. But the fact that January 6th does seem to have been a false flag event, that Ray Epps, of course, the notorious agitator, is on video multiple times saying we have to go into the Capitol. Nobody else is on video saying we have to go into the Capitol, and yet he's not been arrested, not been charged. He's fine, whereas people who went into the Capitol when the cops opened the doors and took selfies have been in the dungeon in the Capitol ever since. This is an appalling miscarriage of justice, but it indicates, it's very clear that Ray Epps was a Fed, that the whole thing was a setup designed to discredit Trump and to portray supporters of Trump as insurrectionists. Mm-hmm. But the fact that it's increasingly clear that the whole thing was a setup is an indication that you have to push Americans very far for them to be violent. And this is because we have a tradition of justice and even-handedness in this country. Now the left is throwing that to the wind. We hope that we can redress this peacefully and should not take any bait to react violently, because that will only make things worse.
Sir, do you feel like the government will be trying to ramp up the efforts by introducing even more radical policies and measures to advance their agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what the plan is, to keep pushing farther and farther and farther until they have the socialist, internationalist, authoritarian state that they want. And if we protest violently, then they can crack down and establish the socialist, authoritarian, internationalist state that they want. So either way, they win. The only problem is that people are waking up to it, and they may not get away with this. There are all sorts of obstacles in their path now. Donald Trump, they never expected was going to be elected president in 2016. It was supposed to be Hillary Clinton who would continue to implement this agenda, and now we would be well into her second term. No problem. And America would be well on the way. But instead, when Trump was elected, and precisely because they then moved to destroy him, we found out that all this was happening. and now are much more aware and resolute in resisting it. And then Elon Musk buys Twitter and suddenly turns out to be an advocate, at least to some degree, of the freedom of speech. And nobody expected that. And so one of their foremost weapons for controlling the public discourse and discrediting and silencing their opponents is now out of their control. And if they crack down on it, then they're exposed even further. And so there's tremendous hope for the future, actually. A lot of things have not broken in the way that they expected, and now they're exposed.
So you're optimistic about the future. What's your advice to Americans on defeating the leftist forces without resorting to violence?
We need to begin to speak about their overall agenda. You never hear the Republican establishment doing this. You never hear Kevin McCarthy or Mitch McConnell or even Donald Trump to a tremendous degree, or even Ron DeSantis speaking about the fact that the left is totalitarian. They are trying to destroy their opposition. People need to be standing up and saying that Biden's speech was what was outside the bounds of acceptable political discourse in America, not the MAGA Republicans. People need to be standing up and saying that Representative Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas, who just introduced a bill into the House criminalizing hate speech, that ought to be something that ends up with her censure and resignation from Congress for her transgression of the First Amendment. But we don't see patriots fighting these battles, and I think it's because they're largely unaware of what the agenda, the whole agenda, really is. And that's what the Sumter Gambit is designed to correct.
Sir, I would like to thank you so much for your time today. Please tell us how to follow you and your work and where to find your book.
Thank you. Yes, I'm at jihadwatch.org, which covers international jihad activity on a daily basis and also the efforts of the totalitarian left. The Sumter Gambit is at Amazon and anywhere that books are sold. And I'm also at Jihad Watch RS on Twitter.
Wonderful. That was Robert Spencer, everyone. Thank you for watching. I'm Veronica Kirilenko of the New American Magazine.
Imprisonment, forced labor, permanent separation from my family. Perhaps death. I knew what could happen to people who were caught trying to defect, but the watchtowers stood yards away. The possibility of a new life in a different world, one without tyranny, was within sight. The West. I thought of the rewards no longer crushed under the boot of communism. I would work and make money, no longer restrained by the chains of collectivism. I would say what I wanted, without fear of spies and informants nearby. I would be free. The frozen rain and Romanian mud seeped through my gloves and cloths. I fantasized about the fire burning in the wood stove of my parents' home, but I pushed those thoughts from my mind, closed my eyes, and waited for the cover of the darkness.
Get Defector, a true story of tyranny, liberty, and purpose by Mark Hobafkovich with Paul Dragu, a thrilling page-turner that will remind you how precious yet vulnerable freedom is. Available at shopjbs.org or Amazon. For a limited time, get 20% off your entire order using promo code Defector20 when you purchase Defector at shopjbs.org.